The day I took command of the 3rd Battalion, one of my senior non-commissioned officers looked past me during the change of command ceremony and shook the outgoing commander's hand for what felt like a full 10 seconds too long. He didn't shake mine at all. He said he wasn't sure the timing worked out, and walked off before I could respond. 800 soldiers were now mine to lead. And at least 3 of my most senior people had already decided, before I gave a single order, that I didn't belong at the front of that formation. 1 year later, I stood in that same room and signed the discharge paperwork for 2 of them myself. Welcome back to Kayla's Dark Truth. If you've ever had to lead people who spent months waiting for you to fail, this one's for you. Drop a comment when you get to the readiness inspection scene. That's where things really turn. And subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kessler. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent 19 years in the Army, Armor Branch, which, if you don't know much about military culture, is one of the more traditionally male-dominated combat arms specialties. Tanks. Armored vehicles. The kind of branch where, even now, women make up a small fraction of the officer corps, and an even smaller fraction of battalion commanders. I didn't go into armor to prove a point. I went into it because I genuinely loved it, the mechanics, the tactics, the specific kind of problem-solving that comes with commanding a 1,500-pound crew inside a moving weapons platform. But loving something doesn't exempt you from the culture around it. I spent my entire career being the only woman in most rooms I walked into. I got used to it. I got good at doing my job well enough that eventually, the doubt in the room would quiet down, at least a little, at least for a while. By the time I made lieutenant colonel and was selected for battalion command, I genuinely believed I'd earned enough of a reputation that the doubt phase was mostly behind me. I was wrong. Command is a reset button. Every time you walk into a new formation, you start from zero with the people who are now supposed to follow you into difficult, sometimes dangerous situations. And this particular battalion had a reputation of its own, tight-knit, proud, led by a commander before me who'd been enormously popular, a guy named Colonel Daniose who'd led them through 2 rotations and was beloved by nearly everyone in the formation. I was replacing a legend. And I was doing it as the first woman to command that battalion in its 60-year history. The resistance wasn't loud, at least not at first. Nobody stood up in a meeting and said, "I don't think a woman should command this battalion." That's not usually how it works in a professional environment where people know exactly what they're allowed to say out loud. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to address because of it. It showed up in small things. Command Sergeant Major Reyes, my senior enlisted advisor, the person who's supposed to be my closest partner in running that battalion, would bring issues to my executive officer instead of me, as though he needed a male filter between himself and my decisions. Major Coleman, one of my company commanders, had a habit of rephrasing my guidance back to the room in his own words during meetings, as if my original instructions needed translation to be taken seriously. And First Sergeant Grant, a 19-year veteran with a reputation for being blunt to the point of insubordination, simply didn't show up to 2 of my early staff meetings, citing scheduling conflicts that didn't hold up under scrutiny. I noticed all of it. I want to be honest that in the first few months, I second-guessed myself more than I let anyone see. I'd lie awake some nights wondering if I was reading too much into ordinary friction, or if I was being naive about how much of it was really about my gender versus just normal resistance to a new commander taking over from someone beloved. I decided fairly early that I wasn't going to fight the doubt directly. I've watched other female officers try that approach, calling it out explicitly, demanding respect through confrontation, and sometimes it works, but it often just confirms whatever bias people are already carrying, makes you the difficult commander instead of the doubted one. I chose a different approach. I decided I was simply going to be excellent at the job, consistently, patiently, for as long as it took, and let that do the talking. My first real test came 4 months into command, during a National Training Center rotation, essentially a massive, grueling simulated combat exercise out in the California desert that's designed to expose every weakness in a unit's readiness. It's widely considered one of the hardest things a battalion does outside of actual combat deployment. 2 weeks before we rotated out, First Sergeant Grant came to me, finally, directly, for the first time since I'd taken command, with a blunt assessment. "Ma'am, respectfully, some of the guys don't think you've got the tactical background to run this rotation. Colonel Osei ran 3 of these. You haven't run one." I appreciated the honesty, even if it stung. "You're right that I haven't run one as a battalion commander," I said. "I have run 2 as a company commander, and I served as an operations officer for a rotation as a major. I'm not walking in blind, First Sergeant. But I hear you." I could have ended the conversation there. Instead, I asked him to walk the training plan with me, line by line, and tell me honestly where he thought it was weak. He did. Some of his critiques were fair, and I adjusted the plan based on them. Some weren't, and I explained my reasoning until he either agreed or at least understood where I was coming from. That rotation was brutal, 11 days of nearly continuous operations, minimal sleep, simulated combat scenarios that pushed every system in the battalion to its breaking point. We didn't win every engagement. No battalion does. But we finished that rotation with one of the better overall readiness assessments the battalion had posted in years, according to the observer controller team that grades these things. First Sergeant Grant found me afterward, exhausted, covered in desert dust like everyone else. "I was wrong to doubt the plan, ma'am," he said. "I won't make that mistake again." That was a turning point for him. It was not, unfortunately, a turning point for everyone. Command Sergeant Major Reyes and Major Coleman remained a different problem entirely. Where First Sergeant Grant's doubt had been rooted in genuine skepticism that resolved once he saw the evidence, theirs seemed rooted in something less willing to be corrected by results. Over the following months, a pattern emerged that I started documenting carefully, both because good leadership requires it and because I've watched enough female officers get gaslit about patterns like this to know I needed a clear record. Reyes would routinely soften or delay implementing guidance I gave in staff meetings, then present modified versions to the formation as though they'd originated from him. Coleman began openly questioning my decisions in front of junior officers, not in a way that crossed clearly into insubordination, but in a steady drip of undermining commentary that I knew was affecting how junior leaders viewed my authority. The moment that finally forced my hand happened during a readiness inspection 6 months into my command. I'd given clear guidance 3 weeks earlier about equipment maintenance standards ahead of an upcoming deployment window. Reyes was responsible for ensuring that guidance reached the company level and was implemented. When the inspection team arrived, nearly a third of Coleman's company's vehicles failed basic maintenance standards that should have been routine. In the after-action review, in front of the full battalion staff, Coleman said, "Honestly, ma'am, I don't think the timeline you gave us was realistic." I looked at him for a long moment. "The timeline was 3 weeks, Major. Every other company in this battalion met it. Yours is the only one that didn't." I paused. I'd like to understand why. He didn't have a good answer. Reyes, sitting beside him, didn't offer one either, even though ensuring that guidance reached company level was explicitly his job as my senior enlisted advisor. I want to be clear about something. I didn't decide to remove Reyes and Coleman because they doubted me. Doubt, even unfair doubt, isn't a fireable offense, and if it were, I'd have spent my whole career firing half the rooms I walked into. I removed them because their doubt had curdled into something that actively compromised the battalion's readiness, a maintenance failure that could have gotten soldiers hurt during an actual deployment, caused by guidance that wasn't properly implemented because the people responsible for implementing it were more invested in undermining me than doing their jobs. That's not a gender issue at that point. That's a performance issue, and I would have made the same call about any officer or NCO, regardless of who they were, if their personal feelings about my authority started costing the formation actual readiness. I met with each of them separately over the following 2 weeks. I laid out the pattern I'd documented, dates, specific instances, the maintenance failure and its cause. I gave both of them the opportunity to respond, to explain, to course correct. Coleman, to his credit, seemed genuinely rattled by seeing the pattern laid out clearly and asked for a chance to prove himself over the next quarter. I gave him that chance, and to be fair, he took it seriously. His performance in the months that followed was solid, and he remained with the battalion. Reyes did not respond the same way. When I laid out the pattern, his response was that he'd always run things his own way and that previous commanders trusted his judgment. I told him that I understood he'd earned a great deal of trust under previous leadership, but that trust has to be renewed with each commander, and that a pattern of independently modifying my guidance without informing me was not something I could continue to work around. He requested reassignment shortly after. Around the same time, based on a combination of that meeting and a broader review of his performance that I initiated with our brigade command, the decision was made that he would be separated from service rather than reassigned. I signed the discharge paperwork myself, as his commander, the way regulations require. The battalion didn't transform overnight after that. Culture shifts slowly, even after a clear moment like that one. But something did change. The staff meetings got quieter in a different way, not the tense quiet of people waiting to see if I'd fail, but the working quiet of people focused on the job in front of them. By the end of that first year, we deployed for a 9-month rotation overseas. It went, by every measure that matters in this line of work, well. We came home with everyone we left with. First Sergeant Grant, who'd become one of my strongest advocates after that National Training Center rotation, told me at our redeployment ceremony that he thought our battalion was in the best shape it had been in years. I still think about that first change of command ceremony sometimes, the 10-second handshake that skipped over me, the quiet certainty in that room that I didn't belong at the front of it. I don't think about it with anger anymore. I think about it as the starting line of a year that ended with me signing 2 discharge papers not out of vindictiveness, but out of the simple, unglamorous requirement that leadership always eventually comes down to, do the job, or don't hold the position. I used to think proving people wrong meant winning some dramatic confrontation, some moment where the doubters are forced to admit out loud that they were wrong about you. It rarely works that way. Usually it just looks like showing up, every day, doing the unglamorous work competently and consistently, until the people who doubted you either come around or remove themselves from the equation entirely. If you're leading a room right now that doesn't fully believe you belong at the front of it, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need their permission to be good at the job. You just need to keep doing it well enough, long enough, that eventually the results speak louder than anyone's doubt ever could. That's my story. If you've ever had to earn a room's respect the hard way, tell me about it in the comments. And if this one meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.